Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. I've just finished running out of hard drive space on my recording machine, so I gotta do an update, and this time around we're actually going to be talking about the Child of Aether project. As I mentioned in the last video, instead of doing one completely ginormous, like 2-3 hour video that covers all of the projects I'm working on, I'm going to be doing these independent ones, individual videos, where just maybe we'll hopefully stick under the 1 hour mark, and we'll just talk about one project at a time. And today, Child of Aether gets a turn. We're going to talk about the stuff we've done in the project. I don't really have anything else to fluff up this introduction with, so let's just get into it. You know what somebody thinks about prototyping? I doubt that the first thing that comes to mind is the main menu. And yet, here we are. Okay, I'm gonna be honest with you, I dreamt this entire menu up. I literally, at 2 in the morning, I woke up in cold sweat thinking, God damn, that was an interesting looking main menu. I have to get my ass down to the computer now and put it together because I will forget if I don't. The music for the main menu was pretty much written quite a while ago. It was one of the jam sessions when I was just writing any sort of beats, ambient stuff for trying to describe how this game is going to sound like musically. So, sticking to the traditional plan of pushing something out as an indie developer, I'm going to be first working on the core mechanics, vertical slice, and making something minimal that is still playable, and then pushing that out as a prelude or as early access. Now, the general plan is to take one of the quest lines, or one of the characters that will participate in the main quest line, and then build a little bit of a story around them for the player to experience. The main story for this game has a perfect character for just such a role, and the prelude is gonna take place in a separate part of the world, where nevertheless the player will be able to participate in all the same gameplay mechanics, mainly like farming, cooking, survival stuff, and combat that will be present in the main game. Now, I could technically make the early access be just that, just basic gameplay, basic survival, and not a whole lot to, or really anything to the main story. But again, all of my projects are narrative, and I think it might be a good idea to offer at least some crumbs of narrative sustenance to anybody who's gonna commit to getting the early access of this project. Once we have the main game up and running, the main menu is gonna have 2 start new campaign buttons, and switching from one to another is going to change which main menu gets displayed, different camera perspectives, different locales, and different environments. But for what we have here, I think the main menu has pretty much captured and represented what the mood and presentation of the rest of the game is going to be like. One of the biggest time consumers in this project is going to be character animations and character illustration. I can take single time props. Most of them take 1 single frame, at tops 2 or 3 for very quick animation. But characters, oh, there's going to be a lot of work done on each character, and there's going to be a lot of characters that have to be in the game. Primarily, characters do something that props don't, and that would be rotate based on different camera orientations. So for a lot of the static characters, I'm gonna have to draw at least 4 sides, 4 views from which the characters would be seen. If the character's important and they have to do stuff like walk around, participate in combat, I might have to do 8 sides, up, down, left, right, and all the diagonals. Now that also implies we need some combat animations or some ambient animations, which would also have to be animated in all 8 sides. Now this kind of prompts me to either have to very carefully consider how I'm going to handle NPCs, and whether or not every NPC can just get up and participate in combat or walk around, move between different locations, or if I'm going to have to do some clever observing where the player is located, if they're maybe far enough away from the NPC, and just teleporting them out of the way to a different location based on their distance. Now when it comes to NPCs, something that I personally liked in Stalker series, the game Stalker, and I think even in Fallout there's a couple of occasions when you can do so. Regular NPCs can be traded with. However, what I've noticed is that it's very easy to cheese the system and cheese the game where you can just find any random NPCs, or maybe merchant-specific NPCs, and then sell a whole bunch of useless crap and get a whole bunch of in-game currency, and then you can afford whatever the heck you want. Now, Stalker developers had dealt with this situation in a very interesting manner. They didn't allow every single merchant to purchase every single item. Like, for example, weapons merchants were only interested in weapons that were in pristine, almost full condition. But they wouldn't take things like perishables. Now, on the other hand, you could have, let's say, medics. Medics would not be interested in weapons. You could not sell a weapon to a medic, but they would be interested in bandagers, medkits, advanced med units, anything that could be used like alcohol swabs, anything that could be used for medicinal purposes. They would only trade in those items. Now, couple that with the fact that merchants only carry a limited amount of currency, this meant that you couldn't just do gear runs and then come back and sell everything in your inventory and, you know, just come away a rich man. What I figured I can do for general NPCs is they can trade in more or less general purpose items that the player might need out and about. I wanted to make sure that if there's an NPC, you could get at least some basic survival stuff off of them, that being water, raw meat, but I didn't want the players to just treat them like trading posts, mobile trading outposts. So what I figured we can try is have the NPCs only seek certain types of items for trade. So you could purchase whatever the heck you want to purchase from them for the in-game currency, but if you wanted to sell something, it would usually be, let's say, a bottle of water, or let's say a bundle of sticks, or a wood log, if they wanted something like that. The required items would be randomly chosen for each NPC, and there would only be like 6 items tops that each NPC would really be interested in trading for. Otherwise, you can't really unload any random crap out of your inventory onto them and get all of their currency. Now, this doesn't mean that the player couldn't find a way to trade all of their access resources and get at least something for that. And what I'm thinking of doing is implementing some sort of a distant merchant that the player has to travel through dangerous zones, danger lands, to get to in order to be able to trade with them. You couldn't fast travel in there. You have to actually go through the trouble of avoiding or engaging the enemies standing between you and that trader, and then once you actually traverse that, you can sell all your stuff that you don't want and then get some coinage back. On a totally unrelated front, something else I dipped my toes into trying with this project is interactable foliage. I've started working more and more with multi-mesh instance nodes, which is a special node specifically designed for helping you populate your games with thousands of instances of the same mesh. This is perfect for games that use a lot of grass, bushes, foliage, anything that needs to be populated into the world in mass. Now, the biggest problem is that multi-mesh instances are just mesh display nodes. They don't collide, they don't detect collisions, they cannot be detected with collisions, so you have to find a different way of trying to figure out how is the player interacting with the foliage, for example. So what I wanted to do is to make it so that when the player walks through the thick bushes, they actually wiggle, they have a bit of a visual feedback that the player has touched them or went through them. And of course, the biggest hurdle is how do we detect that the player has touched a particular bush? So the way I achieved it is essentially when I run the algorithm for randomly distributing the bushes, I use the location that I've calculated to not only position the instance of the bush, but also position a newly created collision shape, which itself is nested as a child of an area node. So there's only one area node that does the collision, but it has some very interesting features, like for example, you can supply it with multiple collision shapes, and when a collision occurs, it actually is capable of reporting on which collision shape was responsible for detecting a collision. And from what I was told, the area node collisions are not very expensive to process as long as you watch out to disable certain collision layers and exclude anything that shouldn't really interact with it. So basically the area node of these multi-mesh bush instances are going to be existing on a totally separate collision layer, or not even any collision layer at all, and they're only going to be detecting a player who is exclusively located on collision layer number 12, for example. Quite literally a collision layer that is entirely dedicated to containing just the player. Now, that's the easy part. Detecting the player is the easy part. Oh no, place an area node and collision shapes inside? What workload? The tricky part is, how do we then communicate to the player that this collision shape that they walk through is supposed to wiggle this particular bush in the multi-mesh? Well, the way I achieved it is, when I'm creating the bushes using the multi-mesh, they are created in a particular order. So bush 0, bush 1, bush 2, they have a particular order in the multi-mesh instance. When you set the number of instances, let's say to 100, you have to set the location of all 100 instances. So if I'm creating 100 bushes in the multi-mesh instance, I'm going to create 100 collision shapes inside of the area node, and I'm going to create them in the same order, occupying the same physical space in the level as each and every bush. So if there's a bush in the top left corner of the region, there's going to be a collision shape in the top left corner of the region in the same exact place. So if the player hypothetically walks over bush number 17, there's going to be a collision shape number 17 in the same exact space. When the player collides with it, the area node will know that collision shape number 17 was just collided with by the player. Now, how do we communicate that information into the bush? Well, we don't have animations here. I'm not entirely sure if you can have animations with the multi-mesh instance. You probably can, but you can't individually control them. But that's outside the scope. The way I wiggle the bushes is by using a shader with a little bit of a noise texture and some displacement, vertex displacement, and that's basically the genius extent of it. Anybody can really do it. But how do we tell the shader which particular bush to wiggle? Now, this is where I'm going to chew out the Godot developers for lazying out on this system. GameMaker Studio allows you to send an array into a shader. GameMaker can do it. You guys should be able to do it too. Do you know how simple this would have been if all you could do in Godot is send an array into the shader? Right? You have 100 bushes? Cool. Send an array with 100 integer values or float values and just read the values, whatever the appropriate value is for each bush, and then just wiggle the bush by that amount. Control the intensity of the noise by that amount. Simple stuff. Now, what we have to do in Godot is we have to dilly-dally around getting a texture created in code in the CPU side. We then have to reference that texture in the shader. We then have to live modify that texture, so each and every single pixel on that texture is belonging to a particular bush. So if you want bush number 17 to wiggle, you gotta go locate pixel number 17 and make it wiggle as well. Except, how does the shader know which bush is bush number 17? Do you think maybe exposing the instance ID of the multi-mesh would have been smart inside of the shader? Yes, apparently nobody on the Godot site thinks so. Instead, we have to assign each and every instance a custom color value using some ancient, antiquated system, which, you know what, I'm glad we at least had that. And then we have to use that color data to correlate to a particular pixel on the texture. We have to basically convert the color to UV coordinates, and then finally, we could have each bush basically look at a particular pixel and texture, wait for it to turn white, and then up the wiggling effect in the shader, the vertex shader. I probably would have figured that one out pretty quickly if it wasn't for the obscene amount of texture chicanery that Godot likes to do on the back end, like enable filtering, compression, various algorithms, color spaces. And then you look over the picket fence into your neighbor's yard who's using GameMaker Studio, and you realize, oh, you can just send an array into the shader? How nice. Never mind that the rest of the property is on fire. That one part is nice, but the rest is, no, it's a dumpster fire. The grass is greener when there isn't a house fire. So that's how the system works. When we create each and every bush in the multi-mesh instance, we make sure to assign it a custom color, which is pretty much the only piece of uniquely identifying information that you can put into a shader. We're going to be using the red and green channels of that custom color to locate a particular pixel on a custom texture. We create that texture in code. It's basically just a blank image, 64 by 64 pixels. And then whenever the player walks over a particular collision shape of the bush, we convert the number of that collision shape to a particular coordinate on a texture. We set the color of the pixel on that texture to white. And because that texture is being sent into the shader can then take a look at that picture, locate the pixel corresponding to a particular bush, see that it's white, and then apply the white value as the strength of the wiggle, and the rest is history. Now, mind you, if these bushes were a single scene with an animated wiggle, let's say an armature, it would have been infinitely easier, but we can't have thousands of them. We cannot have thousands of rigged meshes out and about, doing their thing, detecting collisions, actively running their code, actively running animations. That's just not a thing that we can do. If we want to cover vast lands with these sort of very simple, logically behaving objects, we have to find ways of grouping them into larger chunks, have the chunk execute all of its behavior for each bush as one single cluster. And the only way we can really achieve that is through shaders and some multi-mesh instancing. This next part was a fun one. What do you do when there's a whole bunch of cool new spanking features, but they all go to Godot 4? You port your project to Godot 4. And considering that I've already done this porting process on the Dreadtail project, I knew exactly what was waiting for me. I have spent the next few hours basically hunting down anything that was broken, which was a lot, and fixing it and porting it over, fixing it up, rewriting a bunch of stuff that basically the Godot 4's automatic project importing system did not catch and could not figure out. And because in certain cases I was using some properties, like in rigid bodies, the freeze mode in Godot 3 could be used to turn a rigid body into a static body, but in Godot 4 there's a dedicated freeze property that you can use to do just that, but they still have a freeze mode property. However, in Godot 4, the purpose of that property is to simply define what type of alternate node the rigid body will turn into when you turn on freeze. Does Godot know that I was using freeze mode to stop rigid bodies from running like rigid bodies when need to? No! So every single rigid body that had freeze mode be used in Godot 3 had its code ported to still use freeze mode, and I had to go through every single one of them and strip them out. Now take this concept and then multiply it by hundreds of cases. And in that case, maybe, just maybe, you will come close to the pure delight that is the porting process from Godot 3 to Godot 4. And it has been a few months, and I still keep finding stuff that the automatic porting process had screwed up. But that's part of the gig.
It's the joys of the porting process, everybody. Put on your helmets.
Needless to say, this broke everything, including the bush wiggling system, because the textures were being handled slightly differently now. It broke the dialogue system, it broke everything. On the bright side, the performance was immediately much better over Godot 3. The way it handles large terrains, large worlds, the Vulkan renderer, everything. Like, it's worth the hassle if you're early on or, you know, early mid development. Yes, porting to Godot 4 is worth all the improvements and all the features and all the additions. It just sucks that this is generally the average porting experience. Once I've retroactively desodomized the entire codebase, I needed to unwind. So what I decided to do is maybe switch my inventory system, instead of having a separate panel, to essentially just be an expandable pop-out of the hotbar. Now, my hotbar is technically already behaving like an inventory. I, way in the ether, no pun intended, the ether of the early stages of this game, I did a dum-dum. I made a mistake of handling the hotbar as a separate data structure from my inventory. And oh boy, the amount of back and forth code I had to write, make sure that I accounted for moving stuff from the hotbar to the inventory, from the inventory to the hotbar, picking stuff out from chests and backpacks and other containers, the merchants. Oh, it was a lot of work. And then I had a great idea, a genius idea, an idea that I've been using ever since in all my other inventories for all my other games. Why don't I make the hotbar be the inventory? It's just gonna be the first 6 or so inventory slots, and I'm just gonna hide them in the inventory backpack itself. So realistically, when you put something into a hotbar, you're just putting something into the first slot of the inventory. When you put something into the second slot of the hotbar, that's the second slot of the inventory. And when you open up the inventory, it just displays the same exact information, except we've simply hidden the first 6 slots because they would have just duplicated the same thing as the hotbar does. Now, that reduces the complexity of the code immensely. And I figured that since we're doing that, and I wanna represent the inventory in the simplest way possible, I can just combine the inventory and the hotbar together as one single system and make the hotbar expand into the inventory when you press a button. Alright, here's a fun little tidbit. Since we're going for a very cartoony, very inky, hand-drawn type style, which a lot of folks, when they first see this project, the first thing that comes to mind is Don't Starve. I figured, okay, well, why don't we lean in on the bit of a cartoony side and make the transition between going interior, exterior, or transition between levels essentially be a circle, a classical circle shrinking into nothing, and then the same effect reverse when you actually step into the new level and it loads up. Very simple effect that was achieved through the use of a shader. Man, I'm starting to use shaders quite a bit for some of the simpler effects just because it tucks them away neatly into the visual code, and it's really simple, and shaders are very, very performative. So something like this quite literally took a single radial gradient, clamping the value between black and white to 0 and 1, and then adding a single value to the texture gradient so that the place where it clips it shifts. And because it's a texture, the circle has a bit of a wobbly nature to it, a bit of a noisy nature to it, which actually gives it an interesting look. Now, between the porting process and figuring out the little minute features and effects, I started losing track of the overall picture, so I committed to getting the core mechanics up and running, and that meant finally addressing the basic craftable systems, or the craftable stations. Now, these stations include the grinding bench, the press, the dilution station, and the chemical mixing station. And the first order of business is I had to figure out how I'm going to handle the user interaction with the interface of these stations. Now, you can see that the grinding station is sitting off to the side, and that has been the case since the beginning of the grinding station's existence several years ago. The idea was that if the player is located within one same space, they would move around between multiple stations and then take something out of this one and then bring it over to another station, pop it in there, and then take the byproducts, maybe toss them into a third station. Basically have a sensation of an involved working space. Now, that had a bit of a clash with another planned feature, which is to give the player the ability to craft and place these stations. So you could technically, in theory, create some sort of an encampment. You know, in Minecraft, you can quite literally turn anything into a base of operation. Go to a new place, 1,000 blocks away, start digging, you know, punch some trees, eat some dirt, and then you got a house. Now, this is no Minecraft, and it has nowhere near that level of openness and freedom. You can't really, let's say, dig into the ground and then it being made out of a bunch of voxels and you can come out of the other end. That's not really what this game is about. But I still wanted to allow the players to go to a place and then claim it as a base of operations, maybe even a temporary one. Maybe they need to be able to quickly craft certain props or do some chemistry to create certain potions because they're basically battling through a very enemy-heavy territory, and then having them travel to a safe house that's far away doesn't really seem to be very reasonable. Now, I'm still on the cusp on that because I could always just design a level in a way where crafting benches are just available in key areas where the player is known to meet adversity. So we're still on the fence about the whole being able to craft and place these crafting stations, but if I do allow the player to craft them, there's going to be a question of having too many crafting stations for simultaneous use nearby. So how do we deal with the interface when there's so many crafting stations near the player? Well, the logical solution would be to allow the player to display multiple pieces of user interface for different crafting stations near each other, and then maybe give the player the ability to move them around. Like Windows allows you to drag the folders and drag the window explorer views, or tabs in your browser. You can move them around, rearrange them. Something that allows the player to organize the interface in the way that is comfortable to whatever stations they currently have placed in front of them. But that, of course, brings challenges of windows. If you have too many windows, how do you move them around? What if you put a window outside of the view? How do you claim it back? Just the whole thing seems like it could turn into a big mess, especially if you ever seen some RPG games, maybe JRPG games or Korean RPG games. They have hundreds of windows, all sorts of stats, lore, recipes, merchant panels, stats panels twice. There's like 5 stats for some reason, or 5 different stat panels. It's just dialogue panels. It's everything on the same screen. And I wanted to avoid that because that you look at that and you're wondering, do I really want to play that game? Nah. So my solution to handling so many interfaces for so many crafting benches is to borrow from games that have had this whole concept figured out ages ago. Minecraft. How does Minecraft deal with you having dozens and dozens of furnaces in a single room? You interact with a furnace, it opens up a piece of interface, it blacks out the rest of the screen, the interface is smack in the middle. Easy as that. If you want to move something, put it into your inventory, go to the different furnace, put it back in. Simple solution. It guarantees that the player is never going to be drowned in a million windows. They don't have to drag anything about, they don't have to muck with anything. It's just super straightforward. So you know what? For the time being, that works for me. I'm gonna go with that. Now the rest of the time was spent preparing the user interfaces for the other crafting stations. Finally. First one being the dilution station. The dilution station is supposed to work by having a number of inventory slots that are placed on top of key components. There's a dedicated inventory slot where you put in the bottle of water. There's another one where you put in an empty flask. There's one where you're supposed to put in the crystal dust. And there's one that acts as an output. The system is fairly straightforward. You put in the crystal dust into one inventory slot, you put in the water into another, you put in an empty flask, and then in the output, once the timer is completed, you get a diluted liquid depending on what dust you put into it. Of course, the dusts themselves come from the grinding bench. The dust can be produced by grinding down things like crystals, diamonds, opals, some sort of jewels, anything that the player can procure through their mining operations. Of course, mining doesn't really, again, mean any sort of voxel or terrain modifications, and there's no blocks to be mined. It's pretty much going to be handled by having special types of rock deposits that are scattered across the top of the game and also in mine shafts. And the player can go there, the player can mine for the necessary resources, and come back, use the grinding bench to grind these crystals down into a powder, and then they can use the powder in the dilution station to get the appropriate liquids. The next station I put together is a crystal press. So the way this station works is you take the powders that you've ground down from the loose, raw crystals and raw opals from the mining operations, you deposit them into the big chassis at the bottom of this crystal. It's like a grid of inventory slots. And then into the top, you are supposed to insert a mold, essentially an imprint of the shape of the crystal which you would like to produce. So you're essentially going to be manufacturing your own clean crystals based on the powders that you put into the inventory slot. The way the code works is it actually takes the color values from each and every powder and it averages them using some hue calculations into some sort of an average color between all of them. And that color is assigned to the output crystal, and technically this means that each and every crystal has its own unique, completely separate set of values. So we're quite literally producing dynamic inventory items here. Now, sure, technically it's maybe not as interesting or flattering as I'm making it out to be, but the idea is that the powders that you collect have properties. You can combine them together into forming these crystals, and those crystals are supposed to inherit the cumulative amounts of these properties. Now, the crystals themselves are going to be used to open certain doors and to be imbued into your weapons or attack cards. You can maybe think of it as the Haradra Cube from Diablo 2, where you put a bunch of gems and opals and crystals into it, and it spews out maybe one good one, and then you can permanently put it into a weapon to enhance that weapon's properties. I'm pretty sure I'm going to make that process permanent, so once you insert it into a card or a weapon, it is now a permanent part of that card or weapon, so there's a little bit of a risk involved in this concept. The final station whose interface we ended up putting together is the mixing station. Now, this is a station that allows you to take the raw diluted chemicals that you have so far harnessed and combine them into one of two things. Either a tonic, which you consume, I think it's either called a tonic or a brew, or you put it together into a potion, and potions you throw. Now, at least at the moment, the difference between a tonic and a potion is just lying in that one difference. Do you consume it or do you throw it? And it's not used in either or case. Albeit, thinking about it now, Minecraft does allow you to either throw a potion or consume it. So maybe separating the two is kind of redundant. But in any case, the behavior of both the tonic and the potion is that they will inherit the properties of those dusts, of those chemicals that you've produced in the other two stations, the grinding bench and the dilution station, and you can mix and match different properties together in order to create combo tonics. So, for example, you could have one tonic that is both producing light, so you become a light emitter, you can illuminate the surrounding area, and a healing one, so that it heals you while you are, I don't know, trying to run away and save your ass and you can't see anything in the dark. So once again, it's kind of a dynamic system. You could combine, let's say, a poison and a fire liquid together, and then when you throw it, both of those effects end up damaging the entity. Now, for example, there could be a phantasm type entity where it gets docile when it's within any sort of light source, and it also takes damage from ethereal power. So you could take, let's say, ethereal water and the light gem dust, combine them together into one single potion, and then when you throw it, both of those effects are specifically catered to deal with that particular type of enemy. And not to mention that I think it might be kind of funny to see somebody accidentally consume the poison, fire, instant death, slowness potion instead of the healing one. Or maybe they accidentally throw the healing potion at the enemy and then they're like, well, that was fun. Now, something to consider for me is that maybe some people might try to min-max these types of stats, and I don't know if there's really any particular benefit to it, but maybe they're gonna just make one potion that has all 100% filled with one type of effect, and they'll just make 20 different potions all filled with 100% of a type of effect. maybe that's gonna work. I don't know if I should implement any penalties. Maybe the effect gets diminished if the more of each potion of the same type you end up using, or the more of each chemical. Or maybe I should give it a boost, but then you have... If I give it a boost, then you have absolutely no reason to ever mix and match multiple chemicals together. So maybe instead I can do a buff specifically when you use a rich amalgamation of different chemicals. I don't know. Might have to figure this out. Either way, this particular station has a tall deposit region which has multiple inventory slots inside of it. You take your diluted liquids, deposit them into these slots, and then the machine is going to cycle through them, and as it cycles through them, it will deposit a new potion or a new tonic into an empty flask below. As a matter of fact, the difference between a throwable potion and a consumable tonic is the shape of the flask that you deposit it into. So perhaps actually discerning between the two would help the player visually see quickly the difference, which one is throwable, which one's consumable. So it could reduce the accidental consumptions, but then I think it also kind of eliminates it entirely. I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments, how I should go about it. Maybe you guys can have some bright ideas that I'm not seeing here. Now, this does neatly roll into the next issue that I also have to figure out, and that would be the question of replayability and the question of randomness in this game. Way back, the general game plan for this project was to make these crystals, which are basically a core component of pretty much all of your buffs and nerfs that you can execute in the game on your gear or on yourself or on the enemies, would basically be randomly determined from player to player. In every single game it would be different. So far in this game we have crystals and we have ambers, and they're named in this ethereal way when you have warm amber and you have wind amber and you have fume amber, whatever. The amber names don't necessarily correspond to the effects those ambers represent. So we could say that, let's say, when you chop down a tree, you could get an earth amber. But in someone else's game, when you chop it down the tree, you could get a warm amber, or you can get a fog amber. Now, the names could be different, the effects could be the same, or we do vice versa. When you chop down a tree, you always get, let's say, a leaf amber or an earth amber. But the effects of that amber are randomized. They're always different per game. So when you start a new game, that's when all the amber property assignments get randomized, but they're persistent throughout that entire campaign. To me, that presents an opportunity to make the game have randomly generated recipes. So what it means is that when the player plays Minecraft, they know that arranging 2 sticks above each other and then 3 stones in a row gives you a pickaxe, a stone pickaxe. Now, once you remember the recipes, you never have to discover that recipe again. But what if, since this is a game that borrows components from RPG games, the recipes are rewards for the player doing certain tasks and certain quests? Okay, well, I mean, we could technically make recipes be locked away behind a menu, and then you can only craft whatever's in that menu of recipes, which means you have to go out and do the quest and get the recipe to be able to craft that thing from that point on. And I figured that, okay, well, what's another way to do that without actually doing that? Randomized crafting recipes. So I don't really know if this is even the most intuitive way to do it, but right now it's kind of dumb. It's like if you want to craft a special type of tool, you have to do a stick, some metal, and then a particular type of amber. And what amber it is the part that has to be random. That is for crafting physical tools and physical objects. There's also the process of crafting or chemically creating your potions and tonics. So where in one person's game, it takes 2 warm amber dusts and then 1, I don't know, green crystal, right? Let's stick to colors for the time being. It takes those 3 components to create, let's say, a healing potion. But in another person's game, it would be 1 light crystal, which technically light crystals are persistently the one currency unit and the most important type of crystal in the game. It is the currency, and it is also what you make objects that cast light out of. So for another person, it would be that, maybe light crystal dust, which also sounds like meth, but it's that and maybe some like other crystal dusts that you find in another part of the map. So they're random, sure, but what about the process of procuring those components? What if for one person the recipe for a healing potion is going to be 2 earth crystals or earth ambers, which are procured from a tree, and then 1 fog amber, which is procured from a puddle, right? A crystal that grows exclusively around a puddle. Well, those could be very common objects that you can find in the game. But what if for another player it's, I don't know, 1 fog crystal and then another middle of fuck nowhere end game crystal, right? That you only find in this hard difficulty area. Well, that doesn't seem to be fair, right? So now we have an issue where I want to make it random. I don't want to make the randomness randomly make it so hard to procure that you'll not be able to complete the game. So do we make all of these ambers be procurable in an easy fashion, which kind of in its own way diminishes the effectiveness or the value of the randomness of the whole system? Or do we forego the entire randomness thing and just say, oh yeah, you know exactly where to get these crystals, but you have to unlock the recipes by doing certain quests. These are records that are stored in your player data, so you have to complete certain quests to be able to craft these particular items. Hypothetically, I could make the properties of the crystals themselves be random, which means when the player discovers the crystal, they have to do research in order to find out what properties it has, and then they would be able to put 2 and 2 together where the recipes are totally random, so not even the item names are the same, and they have to figure out which 2 or 3 ingredients have to go together to make these basic potions. So lots to think about. I gotta give the task to my brain and have it mull it over and come up with something suitable. Okay, now, coincidentally, we've managed to leave the best for last. I don't know what came over me and why I thought this was anywhere remotely a smart idea, but I decided to try implementing a typing of the dead type attack system. I don't know why, it's just been looming over my head, and I think in order to make it go away, I just have to make it and see how it feels. So, here's the spiel. The attack system that I wanted to make for this game, I've been mulling over different systems, different approaches, how to make it more interesting than just click, 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 wait for recharge, click, 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 he's dead, move on to the next one. Like, I don't want it to be a clicking simulator. I don't want it to be another Diablo, you know, League of Lineage. I don't want it to be just click on the enemy and then auto attack the enemy with whatever attacks you have. Now, I also didn't want it to be completely turn-based, which is why you've seen in one of the previous updates, the combat system we're using right now involves cards which determine what kind of attack you're going to perform next. So there's at least a little bit of strategy that you could put into organizing, let's say, putting your best cards forward, literally. You would have to pay some of the action points in order to be able to do that, but it is a game mechanic that is available to you. And don't get me wrong, that part is really fun, and that part I think is going to stay in the game for sure. But after that, after you organize your cards, you still have to left click on the enemy to perform the attack. Now, the last thing I've done before I implemented this system was, instead of left-clicking on the enemy, you instead swipe left on the enemy, like you're trying to bypass the school of whales that somehow beached into your Tinder feed. So sure, it's not clicking, but it's still boring as shit. I am searching for some kind of a middle ground between skills and strategy. If I go full-on card combat, like Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Magic the Gathering, Inscription, Slay the Spire, Darkest Dungeon, then I'm going straight into turn-based combat territory, and I don't think that I want to go full turn-based combat for this game. I'm slowly starting to warm up to it in light of lack of viable alternatives, but what can you do? How can you use the strategy from turn-based combat without delving directly into turn-based combat? How do you involve at least a little bit of skill? And the only way that became apparent to me is a typing game. A typing game is skill-based. Literally, your skill of how fast you can type is at the core of how fast you can deal damage to these enemies. As a matter of fact, that very system may just even eliminate the need to cool down and prep cards. You can see how when you deal damage with a card, the next one can't be used immediately. You have to give it a second to prep, to wind up, so to speak. Now, that mechanic was a direct deterrent from click spamming on the enemy and just expanding all of the cards you have in the deck in the matter of half a second and insta-killing something. So that was a delay specifically to mitigate that problem. Now, technically, if you have to type in the word to perform an attack, it seems goofy, but it does involve skill, it does take time, and the better you get at it, the better you can turn out damages for all of your enemies. And then you can even target which enemy you'd like to damage just by making sure you start your attack with a particular letter. Now, the enemies currently don't deal any damage. Once they do, I could also represent the damage as another word that you can type in order to block or deflect the attack. You could technically say that certain enemies could have powerful attacks, so you have to use multiple words in order to let's say, parry that particular attack from that enemy. So since it takes time to type up the words, that is a direct correlation to your skill. Technically, it checks all the boxes on the requirement for pairing the strategies of card-based combat with the direct involvement of the player through skill-based combat. The only thing that I am worried about is that it looks goofy as shit. I personally like it, but will other players share in that sentiment? Because I don't know about you, I don't see a lot of typing games out there in the market. So what if somebody looks at the game and thinks, this is some geeky ass shit, I ain't playing this? Which is part of the reason that I implemented this combat system as a separate drag-and-droppable node that I can add to any enemy whom I would like to make use of the system. So if I don't want this system, I could just delete that node and then bam, it's gone. It's not intrinsically coded into anything that will break everything if I remove it. This does mean that I can reuse the system for other stuff, like for example, you walk up to a door, it's got a passcode on it, okay, to interact with the passcode, I just place the damage node into it, and then the player needs to damage it to open up a door. It's kind of goofy, it's not really a password, but it is what it is. Now, having done this, having actually finished it and implemented it, and it works, it costs the card, it damages the enemy, there's a lot more that could be done to actually communicate that better, but it's here, it's done, it's in the game, I can leave it be, I can leave it behind, move on to other stuff, and if I'm gonna come up with a better damaging system, combat system, that actually involves skill, I can come back and, you know, swap out the node for a different one and just remake the system and see how that works out. If you know of an interesting way to involve player skill in a manner that can be paired up with the cards, let me know. I'd like to hear your opinion. If you like the typing thing, I'll keep the typing thing, no problem. Personally, I like it, I just think it might look a little goofy. Almost like typing games are a particular niche of a sub-niche of a sub-niche. So if I have typing in this game, it's gonna kind of only attract a certain type of crowd, and it's not really gonna be accessible to a wider audience. That wider audience, of course, being exclusively factory worker employees who man the lathes and the CNC machines with their fingers. Anyways, this is all the updates I have for you for Child of Aether. The porting process kind of took out the bulk of it, and there wasn't really a heck of a lot of interesting stuff to show. But I think we are approaching a point where I can start working more and more on the dialogues and the characters and the quests, because the core systems are slowly coming together. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you have any ideas, if you want to drop them down in the comments. If you'd like to be more involved and drop some ideas and offer some advice, you can do so through the Eisenstadt Studio Discord server. And I'll see you guys in the next update.